In this video, we will discuss a very important and complex topic. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? Why did the socialist order collapse? In order to analyze how or why the Soviet Union collapsed, we first need to understand what the Soviet Union stands for. The Soviet Union represents the largest, most comprehensive move ever made to achieve a classless society. In the 74 years of its existence, the Soviet peoples have achieved great successes. In the Soviet Union, very important achievements were made. Achievements that proved that humanity was not doomed to exploitation. Great strides have been made towards creating a society where man does not exploit man, and where equality and freedom prevail. Despite decades of slander campaigns and relentless anti-propaganda, the Soviet Union managed to engrave all these achievements in history. Of course, important mistakes were also made in the Soviet Union. And these mistakes laid the groundwork for the collapse of the country. Yet the Soviet Union as a whole remains the greatest source of inspiration for humanity. The Soviet Union not only eliminated the exploiting classes of the old order, but also managed to solve the problems of inflation, unemployment, racial and national discrimination. It eliminated the gap between poverty and wealth, inequalities in education and opportunity. In 50 years, industrial production in the country rose from 12% of that in the US to 80%. In the same period, agricultural production reached 85% of the US level. Never before had a society raised living standards and production levels so rapidly. Employment was secured. Everyone was entitled to free education, starting from kindergarten and continuing through primary and secondary education, university, and evening schools. In addition to free education, students were given scholarships to cover living expenses. Free healthcare was provided to everyone. There were twice as many doctors per capita as in the United States. Workers who were injured or sick had job security and continued to be paid during illness. Sanatoriums, resorts, and children's camps were either free or paid for out of public funds. Trade unions had the power to reject dismissals and recall managers. The state controlled all prices and provided basic food and housing. Rents could be covered with only 2 to 3% of the family budget, and other utilities such as water, electricity, and telephone with 4 to 5%. When it came to housing, there was no discrimination based on income. In addition to living standards, great efforts were made for the cultural and intellectual development of Soviet citizens. State subsidies ensured that the prices of books, periodicals, and cultural events were kept to a minimum. According to UNESCO, Soviet citizens read more books and watched more movies than any other people in the world. The number of people visiting museums each year was almost half of the total population, and attendance at concerts, theaters, and other events exceeded the total population. The Soviet Union did all this and much more, and lived for 74 years. But unfortunately, it ceased to exist in 1991 after 74 years. Soviet territories were divided into 15 new countries. The socialist order collapsed, and capitalism came to rule in this geography that had turned its face to the future with socialism. In hindsight, this is, unfortunately, a historic defeat for humanity. This collapse is as real as all the achievements of the Soviet Union. But the collapse of the Soviet Union and the socialist order does not devalue any of the gains and 74 years of history. This history stands at the top of the achievements of humanity and sheds light on the future of humanity. Therefore, the reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union cannot obscure this fact. The Soviet Union and the experience of socialism that it engraved in history is the most advanced level that humanity has ever reached and must be embraced. In order to realize a better version of this experience, it is of great importance to understand the collapse and draw lessons from it. Because the collapse of the socialist order in the Soviet Union was not inevitable, many of the problems that brought about its collapse were avoidable. Many others could have been solved after they arose. So almost none of these problems were inevitable, and that collapse could have been prevented until the last moment. With the necessary will, the collapse could have been prevented and the Soviet Union could have been resurrected. This is precisely why the causes of the collapse need to be carefully and painstakingly addressed and analyzed. 1. Ideological disorientation. The collapse was the result of a complex set of dynamics, and there was a significant interaction between these dynamics. On the other hand, it must be emphasized at the outset that all the factors that can be said to have had an impact on the collapse have a common ground. It is not possible to think of any of the factors that led to the collapse independently of this phenomenon. This phenomenon can be summarized as ideological disorientation. In the early years of the Soviet Union, from the revolution in 1917 until the late 1940s, there was a fierce ideological struggle. From the late 1940s onwards, political priorities shifted, but no direction was defined for the ideological struggle. In the first period, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which had a clear ideological direction in terms of the construction of socialism, mobilized the Soviet society in this direction. A great excitement was created within the society. Later, however, the loss of this clarity led to the erosion of the party's pioneering function. The party, which should always defend and represent what is better, more progressive and advanced, has drifted to a point where mediocrity dominated. In the process, the society also lost its initial excitement and dynamism. Soviet people unwittingly became alienated from the ideals of socialism. As the Soviet Union was being undermined, they became unable to object this process, and in the end, they were unable to display the dynamism to prevent the destruction of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, attacked from all sides by imperialism, gradually stopped fighting the capitalist world and became indifferent to the attacks and interventions of the other side. Cuba should be mentioned here. One of the most important reasons for the survival of socialism in Cuba today, in spite of all its problems, is that the Cuban Communist Party has developed a style of politics that seeks to keep the society awake. Cuban society in general and the Cuban working class are still struggling to keep the revolution alive and fighting for socialism. The Soviet Union failed to do this. With what we have said so far, we have underlined an important fact. Not only in Soviet territory, but in any country, the vanguard party has the historical function of guiding this process, both in the realization of the revolution and in the process of building socialism that begins after the revolution. Otherwise, that is, if left to its own devices, the process will evolve into the restoration of capitalism, that is, the re-emergence of the capitalist order. Indeed, examples of this have been seen in the past. We can use here the analogy of two prominent writers on the collapse of the Soviet Union. Capitalism is like a raft. Left to the flow of the water, it finds its own way. The invisible hand of the market gives the capitalist system a certain direction. But socialism is not like that. It can be compared to an airplane. It has to be constantly guided and kept on a certain course. Therefore, its survival depends on different, perhaps more challenging factors. Its survival is more difficult, but it is certainly possible and necessary for humanity. Two, external dynamics. Of course, external dynamics must also be mentioned, because what we call ideological disorientation had seriously undermined the struggle against imperialism. Meanwhile, imperialism was waging a very systematic struggle to destroy the socialist order in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was founded in a territory that had lagged behind in the development of capitalism. It struggled with great difficulties. On the one hand, the country was backward in terms of development. On the other hand, imperialism gave the revolution almost no breathing space. After the revolution in 1917, reactionary forces supported by imperialism started a civil war. Soviet power emerged victorious from this war, which lasted 6 years. During the rest of the 1920s, great strides were made in the construction of socialism. By the 1930s, however, fascism was on the rise in Europe and the footsteps of a new capitalist war of division could be heard. When war broke out in 1939, the Soviet Union bought time through successful strategic maneuvering. But it was inevitable that the war would involve the Soviet Union, that capitalism would attack the socialist country that had changed the course of history. The war caused the deaths of nearly 27 million Soviet citizens and devastated the country's economy. As the country began to recover from its wounds, it came face to face with the Cold War from the late 1940s onwards. This dangerous conflict, the effects of which became clearer over the years, lasted until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. In short, the Soviet Union has been subjected to the relentless pressure of imperialism throughout its history. This was inevitable as capitalism continued to dominate most of the world. These external dynamics and the pressure created by imperialism were decisive in increasing the impact of all the reasons for its collapse, which we will discuss in the rest of the video. But it was not a historical necessity that this would lead to the collapse of the socialist order. It could have been the other way around. Socialism could have prevailed. What should have happened was that an ideological struggle could have been waged to withstand this pressure. But it didn't happen. The struggle could not be waged. 3. Economic problems. It is often stated, especially by anti-communists, that economic problems played a role in the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the socialist system was an economic failure. It is true that the Soviet Union had serious economic problems. The revolution took place in backward lands, and it was here that socialism began to be built. Decades were spent in wars. It was impossible not to face economic problems. But didn't the capitalist world face economic problems? How many examples can we name where the economy has been doing well for years and years? The economic problems of the Soviet Union were important, but they were not the basis for the collapse of the socialist system. Economic problems were fed by the inadequacy of the ideological struggle. The developments in agriculture in the Soviet Union are a case in point. In the Soviet territories, which were backward in terms of capitalist development, the ideological comprehension and transformation of the peasantry after the revolution was a necessity. Collectivization, which intensified in the 1930s, was not enough to force more advanced social relations in the countryside. The mechanization of agriculture was late. The delay in development weighed heavily on the Soviet economy. In such a situation, it was necessary to focus on ideological and political struggle for the ideological transformation of the peasantry. But this could not be done. One of the important steps taken in agriculture was the establishment of state-owned farms, the sovkhozes, and collectively owned farms, the kolkhozes. A mixed form of ownership emerged in the collective farms. The counterpart of this was a mixed social organization and a mixed class character. By the mid-1930s, millions of Soviet peasants were concentrated in kolkhozes, which numbered 250,000. Their living conditions were considerably improved. But they were ideologically backward and needed to be given a direction, a goal, and moved forward. This could not be done. Collective property had to be the obligatory practice of a certain period, to be replaced by state property. The kolkhoz system was an intermediate stage in the transition to state ownership, as it involved commodity production. From the 1950s onwards, the idea that collective ownership could be permanent and that the kolkhoz system could lead to communism became entrenched. The way for an ideological and political move was closed. In a sense, the peasantry was left to its own devices. The kolkhoz system was presented as another form of socialist property. Space was opened for a practice called garden economy. Accordingly, the peasants were able to use the land that had been opened up for their individual use according to their own needs. But it did not stop there. They were not content with using the produce for their own needs. The products began to be put on the market. Thus, while claiming to be marching towards communism, space was opened for the petty bourgeoisie and its ideology. Through this, selfishness and self-interest, a characteristic inherent in bourgeois ideology, manifested itself. A market emerged that had to be fought, but this market could not be fought. To this must be added illegal economic activities. These activities became particularly problematic after 1953, after Stalin's death. They included theft of state property, use of state resources for one's own benefit, black market and simple unregistered economic activities. And these activities led to the emergence of a kind of underground market. Such markets, of course, did not rise to the level that alone led to the collapse of socialism in the Soviet Union. But in combination with the other phenomena we have mentioned and will mention, these markets also had an impact on the collapse. Such practices and economic factors also had a negative effect on planning. While markets were taken into consideration, central planning was not done properly. Failure to do so led to certain economic problems. But another reason for the failure of central planning was ideological. Central planning required an ideologically and politically dynamic, productive, and creative vanguard party that would move the society and the system forward. However, as we said earlier, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union lost these qualities over the years, and this caused great difficulties in the functioning of central planning. As in any country, the Soviet economy, of course, had its problems. It is worth remembering that the country was founded at a very backward point economically, in terms of capitalist development, in terms of industrialization, and that the construction of socialism started from such a backward point. Over the years, great strides have been made to overcome the problems created by this fact. The quality of life of the Soviet peoples reached very advanced levels. Despite these steps, problems such as inefficiency and sluggishness emerged. But let us emphasize again, none of these were insurmountable problems. The reason why they could not be overcome must be sought in the political and ideological sphere. It is especially important to emphasize this for the Gorbachev era, that is, for the final stage. Practices that opened up space for private capital, such as the kolkhoz or garden economy, and illegal economic activities created a slippery slope for the Soviet leadership, which had withdrawn and neglected the ideological struggle. When the ideological struggle was withdrawn, the working class, the engine of socialism, became depoliticized and lost its combative character. In the Soviet Union from the early 1950s, the struggle was gradually eased. By the mid-1980s, in the Gorbachev era, it began to be emphasized that there were huge problems of the economy. This style became so strong under Gorbachev that it became a problem by itself, on top of the economic problems. Forgetting to struggle, Soviet society rapidly lost its commitment to socialism, which was weakening. 4. Formalist competition instead of fighting capitalism. One of the reasons given for the collapse of socialism in the Soviet Union was the country's technological backwardness. Inevitably, one of the contexts in which the Soviet Union's economy lost its direction was in the field of technology. While it is true that there were bottlenecks here too, none of this was the basis for the collapse of the socialist order. In fact, a report published in the US in the early 1980s complained that in physics and mathematics, the US had fallen far behind the Soviet Union. It is worth remembering how far the Soviets had advanced in space and in the arms industry. And this was an achievement that lasted until the collapse of the country, although there have been setbacks in recent years. On the other hand, in the last years of the Soviet Union, the country had generally fallen behind the US in technology. The loss of ideological and political direction, which we have tried to define as the basis of the collapse, can also be defined in this field. Although in the last years the Soviet Union had generally fallen behind the US in the field of technology, the impact of this on the collapse must be considered in a different context. In the field of technology, as in some other areas, the preference of getting on the same racetrack with the imperialist countries was made, so to speak. The notion of struggling against the capitalist world gave way to competing with capitalism. Attempts were made to find capitalist solutions to the problems of the process of socialist establishment. This was reflected in the field of economics under many headings such as productivity, growth, and consumption. Especially starting in the 1950s, a great deal of attention was paid to how the US economy achieved efficiency, and some Soviet economists began to envy certain features of capitalism. Soviet economists who studied in the US analyzed how the capitalist economy worked. Efforts were made to apply such solutions to the Soviet Union. The task was not to try to compete with capitalism, but to persist in the socialist way of life. And this, of course, could only be realized if the Soviet people ideologically embraced it. Science and technology had to be transferred to life in harmony with this way of life, and ways had to be created for this. For this, ideological and political goals had to be clearly defined revolutionary goals. The fact that these goals were not defined laid the groundwork for the Soviet technological backwardness in some respects. 5. Weakening of party cadres. The cadres, especially the executive cadres, of the party, which is the vanguard in the process of the establishment of socialism, must exhibit the dynamism of taking society forward in line with the goals of socialism and constantly reproduce this. Of course, for this, party cadres must be ideologically and politically equipped. The inadequacies of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the ideological struggle were inevitably reflected in the political sphere. These inadequacies weakened the intellectual pillar of the party. On the one hand, the intellectuals' commitment to socialist ideology and the socialist order weakened, and on the other hand, the intellectual qualities of the party leadership and party cadres weakened. The weakening and loss of direction in the ideological and political struggle prevented the development of a continuous and consistent cadre policy. Over time, this situation led to the erosion and gradual disappearance of the necessary qualities in the party cadres. Theoretical production has gradually weakened and especially in recent years has been reduced to dry and superficial texts. The weakening of the quality of the party cadres was inevitably reflected in the leadership. Under Stalin, although there were inadequacies in some respects, there was always a revolutionary will and great strides were made. The construction of socialism continued with revolutionary moves. However, in Stalin's last years, the steps taken to repair the devastation caused by the Second World War and the search for peace began to slow down the ideological moves. It was precisely during this period that the cadre policy began to weaken. The result was that the leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was assumed by someone like Khrushchev, who lacked important qualities such as depth, creativity, and agility. From this point on, it would not be wrong to liken what was being done to administering rather than governing. A country that was building socialism needed to be governed, not administered. It was imperative for the rulers to pull themselves and society forward with revolutionary moves. In the Soviet Union, where this could not be done, the rulers began to administer, and within 30 years, control was lost. Problems such as status quoism, bureaucratization, and sluggishness emerged precisely for this reason. Over time, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union lacked the dynamism to make the necessary interventions in the state. The Khrushchev-era's declaration that the communist phase was underway was a typical and important example of this administrative approach. This was not meant to set a goal, but to foster the development of complacency in the country. During the period of Brezhnev, who took over the leadership after Khrushchev, although mistakes were reduced, no ideological and political moves were made to overcome the accumulated problems. This process, due to some of the economic practices mentioned earlier and the inability to prevent the influence of the capitalist world, led to the opening of space for bourgeois ideology in the Soviet society, especially from the 1970s onwards. Health, education, cultural workers, and specialized technical personnel began to show a tendency to separate themselves from the working class. The blockage in the ideological struggle made this well-educated group concentrated in the cities vulnerable to bourgeois ideology and paved the way for a process of petty bourgeoisization. The counter-revolution led by Gorbachev and his henchmen would rely on them. 6. Losing intellectuals in the Cold War. We mentioned earlier that the intellectuals' ties with socialist ideology and the socialist order had been weakened. The intellectuals who ideologically lost their way became susceptible to the influence of bourgeois ideology. In the period of the founding of the Soviet Union, on the contrary, intellectuals played an extremely important role in the establishment of the socialist order, in the struggle for it, and in pulling the country and society forward. But after World War II, they too were caught up in the search for peace. Their production continued, of course. The Soviet system continued to produce very productive intellectuals. But the production of intellectuals in fields such as art and academia was far from reflecting the forward-looking moves required by the order. In the 1980s, bourgeois ideology had a strong influence on the intelligentsia, which was left without a compass due to the ideological disorientation in the USSR. The Cold War had a great influence on this. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union failed to anticipate the Cold War, which began sometime after the Second World War. The wars the Soviet Union had been exposed to until then were of the traditional type. Especially after the Soviet involvement, the Second World War took on the character of a war against fascism, which prevented a clear differentiation. Despite the differences between the capitalist Western world and the Soviet Union, ideologically, the two camps did not really go at each other. Therefore, it was not necessary for the Soviets to act with nuanced thinking in politics and ideology during this period. The Cold War, a new kind of war, required the opposite. The capitalist world did not fight the Soviet Union militarily, but in all other areas, a war unprecedented in history. A war to which the Soviets had to respond in a multidimensional and nuanced way. A war to which they had to make swift, flexible, comprehensive and powerful moves in politics and ideology. Soviet society had to be prepared for this war and mobilized for its needs. This could not be done. The more the Soviet Union tried to postpone this struggle, the more it failed to fulfill the requirements of this war, the more it condemned itself to backwardness. Thus, the capitalist world was able to catch up with the Soviet gaps in politics and ideology. The leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union lagged far behind the advanced intellectual production required by this struggle. Both those who assumed the post of General Secretary of the party after Stalin and other leaders of the party almost completely abandoned intellectual and theoretical production. Ideological struggle came to be regarded as a kind of academic field, a specialty, and it was given to a group of people as a task. One of the most important consequences of this was intellectual ineffectiveness. It was enough to repeat certain well-known concepts. Theory was coarsened, Party leaders were quoted liberally. New requirements emerging with the progress of history were not recognized. Thus, the relationship between the party leading the construction of socialism and Marxist-Leninist theory, which should have been inherent, was transformed into a kind of academic relationship. The party dealt with real politics. Those who dealt with theory were the writers at the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union, or the Institute of Marxism-Leninism. The loss of the relationship between intellectual and theoretical production and real politics made intellectuals vulnerable to current political swings. As a result, a distance began to emerge between the intellectuals and the party. Intellectuals became increasingly inspired by the bourgeois ideology. By the 1980s, some would openly engage in anti-communism. In short, the party was aware of the deformation among intellectuals, but failed to intervene and lost them to the bourgeois ideology. Perhaps the most important front of the Cold War was Europe. Throughout the war, capitalism made very serious moves to ideologically remove the peoples of this continent, which for decades had a left-leaning intelligentsia, and in some countries had strong communist parties, from the Soviet sphere of influence. The Soviets, on the other hand, failed to respond to these moves, failed to develop the necessary strategy for a struggle. They failed to take creative steps to comprehend the European intelligentsia. The effects of this would be reflected in the Soviets' relations with their allies. The Soviet Union, for the reasons just mentioned, was unable to wage the necessary ideological struggle against the reformist line called Euro-communism, which the powerful communist parties in Europe developed from the 1970s onwards by moving away from a revolutionary perspective. Over time, Euro-communism turned into hostility to Leninism and the Soviet Union. Thus, a serious distance began to emerge between a part of the world communist movement, a relatively strong part, and the Soviets. As the Soviets failed to develop a strategy of struggle, this pulled back some other communist parties that had been in an advanced position. A similar problem was experienced with the countries in Eastern Europe where socialism was in power. As the Soviets failed to make the necessary ideological interventions in these countries, where socialist governments emerged with different dynamics and at different levels of strength, the distance between the Soviet Union and these countries widened over time. Europe became the area where the Soviet Union and the world working class movement in general were defeated. The lack of perspective in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union grew stronger, and this fact determined the entire foreign policy of the Soviet Union. What happened in Europe was followed by setbacks in other parts of the world. Socialist China became a loss for the Soviet Union. Especially in the 1980s, during the Gorbachev era, there was a succession of other steps that amounted to throwing in the towel. At this point, the policy of peaceful coexistence should be emphasized. Peaceful coexistence, which was an important pillar of the Soviet Union's foreign policy, was actually put forward for the first time during the Lenin era. After the socialist revolution in Russia, when it became clear that the revolutions in other European countries could not take place in a short time, Lenin put forward this principle to emphasize the need to establish relations with capitalist countries in order for the Soviet Union to survive and to build socialism in one country. Diplomatic and economic relations were developed with various capitalist countries. Despite all the efforts of the capitalist world to the contrary, the Soviet Union established itself in the world. Lenin never neglected to emphasize that this policy could not be maintained indefinitely, that there could be no real peace with capitalism, that sooner or later a decisive clash between the two systems would take place. It was, of course, impossible for imperialism to live in peace with socialism. Stalin also maintained this point of view. However, Khrushchev, who assumed the post of General Secretary of the party after Stalin, accepted that capitalism was permanent in the world and argued that the two systems could coexist. He trapped his country and the world communist movement in general in this formula. All he could do was to define a field of struggle such as defeating capitalism in the sphere of material production, which ignored the antagonism between socialism and capitalism. Unfortunately, this policy was continued after Khrushchev. This policy was called détente. The Soviet Union's struggle for peace in the world was, of course, the right approach, but the peace policy was formulated in the wrong way. As imperialism escalated the Cold War and intensified its attacks, the Soviets went on the defensive and tried to prove their innocence. US imperialism launched a major offensive against the Soviets in Europe under the rubric of human rights and democracy, in which it was actually extremely weak. Instead of responding vigorously, the Soviet Union went on the defensive, arguing with the capitalist world. But it was a flawed debate based on the arguments of the capitalist world. The result was the signing of the Helsinki Final Act. This international document, which the Soviets believed would appease imperialism and make it recognize that the Soviet Union was a peace-loving country that respected human rights, turned out to be a document that paved the way for imperialist attacks. In reality, on the question of borders in Europe and the status of Eastern Europe, the Western countries made no concessions. Far from fulfilling Brezhnev's hope of preserving the political status quo and the existing borders, the agreement made it clear that borders and alliances were subject to change, rendering the Brezhnev doctrine null and void. In the end, there was no balanced exchange of compromises between the objectives of the USSR and those of the Western countries. The West prevailed on all important issues. By imposing their own arguments and terminology, the Western powers were eroding the conceptual foundations of the Soviet bloc and sowing the seeds of long-term changes. In the process, the Soviet Union had fewer friends to stand with it against capitalism. Especially with China's break with the socialist camp, a process of isolation took place at the national level. This isolation was taking place at the level of communist and other progressive political forces in different countries as well. However, at the end of the Second World War, the opposite was the case. Even in the societies of the United States and other Western countries, the Soviet Union was widely regarded as the main force that defeated fascism. 40 years later, the Soviet Union, unable to respond adequately to the Cold War moves, had few friends left in the world. After Gorbachev assumed the leadership of the party and the country in 1985, he and a group of people around him set about taking the steps that would deal the final blow to the Soviet Union. There were two concepts that provided the framework for these steps, heralded as the means of solving the society's problems and restoring the socialist order. The first was glasnost, which meant openness, and the second one was perestroika, which meant restructuring. In this process, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was liquidated. The media was handed over to anti-socialist forces. The planned and state-owned economy was privatized and marketized. Separatism was allowed to flourish, and there was a full surrender to US imperialism. The Gorbachev leadership enacted all of these policies as conscious choices. Finally, it is worth emphasizing the following. We have talked about the various problems that led to the collapse of the socialist order in the Soviet Union, and we have emphasized that the failure to make the necessary revolutionary ideological and political moves constituted the basis of these problems. We have underlined that this basis was formed from the early 1950s onwards. Nevertheless, it should be noted that the Soviet Union would probably have continued to exist if, instead of a person like Gorbachev, to whom it would be safe to attribute the epithet traitor, someone else, even if he had various inadequacies, had assumed the leadership of the party and the country, it would have continued to exist as a country with many problems. But it would have. But Gorbachev and some important cadres around him had already lost faith in socialism, had become thoroughly capitalist, and had intervened to destroy the socialist order in the country. Some of them directly collaborated with the imperialists and mediated imperialist interventions. Such cadres dealt the final blow to the country. Couldn't the communists resist this? Yes, they could have resisted, and partly they did. But years of ideological disorientation had led to a kind of disorganization. The counter moves lacked coherence and direction. In August 1991, a group of party officials seized control of the Soviet Union. But instead of making a revolutionary breakthrough, they sought a middle-of-the-road solution, and that's why they dissolved in 2 days. This accelerated the process of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and soon the Soviet Union was no more. The last significant resistance took place in 1993 when the capitalist order was not yet fully established in Russia. It was led by several political groups, including communists, but unfortunately, it was too late. This armed resistance was crushed by tanks. The last attempt to revive the Soviet Union failed. The socialist order established in the Soviet Union has collapsed. But this does not change the fact that socialism is the most advanced point reached by humanity. History is full of defeats. From time to time, there have been historical setbacks, as in the collapse of Soviet socialism, but humanity has always managed to rise again. The Soviet experience is one of the most honorable pages of history. This experience, which existed for a very short period of time, shows that socialism is achievable and viable. What needs to be done today is to draw the necessary lessons from this experience, to struggle to realize a better one, and to keep it alive forever. Because humanity deserves this bright future.